3 days of preseason testing have now finally come to an end, and I've just finished watching every single minute of it. Even though the first race of the season will be in Australia, which has completely different characteristics compared to Bahrain, we finally have our first blurry picture of where each of the teams will probably be relative to one another to start the season. And so despite all of the caveats that go along with preseason testing, here is my ranking of all of the 10 teams going into the 2025 season. First up, and in 10th place, I have got Sauber. Now, as with all of these teams, you are taking an educated guess based off their performance runs, based off their long runs, based off the body language of the car when you're watching onboard, and also the body language of the team, because there is no hiding when a team is struggling, and Sauber is definitely that. There was just nothing impressive about their car whatsoever. It looked to have a lot of instability during both performance and also long runs. Once they did get on the softer tyre, they clearly don't have as much downforce as the other cars because the drivers were waiting far too long to get fully on the power compared it to the other teams. And they also spent a lot of time in the garage with both of their drivers, which is usually an indication of lots of setup changes, which again leads to the fact that they don't have a very good platform to start the season. Gabriel Bortoleto in particular looked like he was struggling a lot. Now, as a rookie you would expect that, but he was taking so many stabs at turning into the corners when he was really trying to push the car in. It does look like a very difficult car to start the season. And next up in 9th, I have got Racing Bulls. And now, to be honest, they were probably one of the quietest teams during preseason testing, and that is not necessarily a bad thing. They just pounded around and did a lot of laps. They did the third most laps with 454. However, in terms of maybe the negatives, Isaac Hadjar definitely looked like a rookie. He didn't quite have the confidence to really push the car, and even when he did, I mean, there was a lot of times where he was a little bit edgy throughout testing. There was a couple of spins, quite a few moments in the gravel for him, and I just think that with Hadjar and also this team in general, there will be a bit of a slow start to the season. Yuki just kept pounding around, didn't do too many fast laps, and did a lot of mileage, which is good. But at the same time, whilst there's nothing to worry about this team, there's absolutely nothing that makes them stand out so far. Coming in 8th place, I have got the Haas team. Now, just like last year, Ayuki Kamatu's philosophy when it comes to testing is just mileage, mileage, and mileage. They focus fully on their race pace and did the second most miles out of any team with 457, and basically spent the first 2 days of preseason testing only doing long runs and absolutely no performance runs. Esteban Ocon by himself did more laps than any other driver with 260 laps across 1.5 days of testing, which by the way is 4.5 times the race distance of the Bahrain Grand Prix. That clearly shows that they were happy with the balance of the car because they didn't spend a lot of time changing things in the garage. The car looked very compliant, very drivable, and Ollie Ben was also bang on the pace compared to his much more experienced teammates. I do think that they're hiding a little bit of raw pace, which we're going to see for the first time properly in Australia, but I think overall it's been a very positive test for Haas. And next up, I have got Aston Martin. And now, they are by far the most difficult team to try to nail down, and I kind of feel a little bit guilty putting them ahead of Haas because, as a team, there is no doubt that they had a worse test compared to Haas. The reason why I'm doing this is purely the Fernando Alonso factor. I want to be honest about that. I just think that Fernando Alonso in any car is going to be a points contender, and so, yeah, the Alonso factor is kind of artificially making me raise Aston Martin up to 7th. They had a very difficult test. They spent a lot of time in the garage, clearly doing a lot of work on the car and experimenting a lot with their car as well. They only did the 9th most laps on the grid, and actually compared to the other teams, not a lot with 306. Lance Stroll also missed the majority of his running in the afternoon session on day 3 due to a health issue, and the team just lost a lot of time, both with the car in the garage making changes and also changing the car for Fernando because physically they're very different drivers and that took a lot of time as well. So this team is definitely starting on the back foot. Historically, they have started with a pretty decent car and then struggled to develop it across the season. But Fernando Alonso in the post-test interview said that this team has a lot of work to do ahead of Australia, which is never, ever a good thing for a driver to say. The next 2 teams at the front of the midfield were very, very hard to choose between, but in 6th place I have got Alpine. Now, across the board, I think Alpine have had a brilliant test. They did very well in terms of mileage, being 4th in the rankings, and also in terms of times, they were consistently very competitive compared to the other teams. Gasly was very positive about where Alpine was, which is great to hear, especially given how badly they started exactly 12 months ago. And again, in terms of their lap times, they were always, with both of their drivers, in the top half of the timesheets every single day. Doohan actually surprised me a little bit. I mean, there's no doubt that he's definitely rough around the edges. He made quite a few mistakes, had quite a few moments going wide and touching the gravel and just those kind of little things, but in terms of his long run pace and also some of his competitive lap times on the softer tyres, he wasn't kind of miles away from Gasly, which I think is a brilliant start given the pressure that he's going to be under. Alpine are one of only 2 teams to not change their chassis for 2025, carrying a lot of their car over from last year, and so far it's worked. It's clearly a package that both of the drivers and especially Gasly are very familiar with. It seems to work well right out of the box and be very competitive right out of the box, and there's just a quiet confidence within the team and especially with Pierre Gasly. However, at the front of the midfield and just ahead of Alpine, I have got Williams. And now, even though they set the fastest time of preseason testing on day 2 with Carlos Sainz, what I found very interesting is that Carlos Sainz in an interview said that he definitely pushed hard on his performance lap on day 2 when the cooler conditions were at their best. The reason he did this is because Williams as a team, perhaps more than any other, were not messing about with trying to sandbag or hide their pace. Sainz is still adapting to a brand new car and also a brand new power unit, and in his own words, he needed to test the car and push it on low fuel because he is still adapting on how to get the most performance out of it. Williams were not shy about giving their drivers more engine mode and perhaps slightly lower fuel levels compared to the other teams, and it seemed like Albon and Sainz were not only very close compared to one another, but that they also had a very consistent package. Williams have tried to sort their instability that they had last season, especially in high-speed corners. And given that we are going to Australia for the first race of the season, which now has a lot of high-speed corners, that is going to be the perfect test of exactly how much progress they have made compared to last season. And now I think we all know who the top 4 teams are going to be going into 2025, but trying to judge between the 4th, 3rd and 2nd team at this moment in time is almost impossible. I have got Red Bull in 4th, but let me just say right from the outset that it is perfectly plausible that we get to Australia and Red Bull are the 2nd best team on the grid. The first thing that I want to say is that there is a very, very clear gap between Lawson and Verstappen so far, which, to be honest, is kind of expected. Liam did not get a lot of running. In fact, Red Bull as a team did the least amount of mileage on the grid with just 304 laps. Liam had a bit of a reliability issue on day 2 with a water pressure leak, and both of the drivers spent a lot of time in the garage. I think it's important to differentiate what Max is going to be able to do in that car and what Liam is going to be able to do in that car, because there was clearly some pace in that Red Bull when Max was driving it, because that is exactly what you'd expect, but neither driver was able to do a full race simulation, and even on day 3 where you'd expect each of the teams to have a pretty good baseline, there were so many setup changes with different front wings, different floors, and I'm just not sure that the team are fully happy with where their car is at the moment. And so I think there's going to be a lot of experimenting and a lot of work for Red Bull to do going into the first race of the season. And next up in 3rd place, I have got Mercedes. And now they finished with more laps than any other team, clocking in at 458. But the difficult thing with them is that even Russell once again reiterated that the cooler conditions at this time of the year in Bahrain kind of works in their favor. No other team has this kind of stigma behind them where their car just seems to work better and better in cooler conditions compared it to the warmer ones, and so there is still quite a bit of unknowns about Mercedes and where they actually are. What I will say is that both of the drivers definitely had the confidence to push very hard and very fast in that car. Even though there was quite a few lockups from both of the drivers, it's difficult to know how much of that was wind related, temperature, or just the drivers perhaps having too much confidence in trying to push the car. Antonelli, however, was very, very impressive. In terms of raw pace, I think that he's going to challenge Russell in qualifying quite a lot throughout the year. But the interesting thing with Antonelli is that you can also tell that he is going to be rough when it comes to tyre wear in the races, because he has this very attacking driving style, using very wider lines and being very aggressive when it comes to his inputs. But that just does not work with the current generation of Pirellis. He clearly still has a long way to go and clearly a lot to learn, because he was nowhere near as good as Russell on the long runs. But I mean, both of the drivers set some pretty good and competitive lap times, and both were able to do a full race simulation. And next up and in second place, I have got Ferrari. Now once again, in my opinion, there is nothing to choose at this moment in time between Max and the Red Bull, the Mercedes and the Ferrari. If you want to make a case that the Red Bull in the hands of Max is the second quickest or the Mercedes is the second quickest, I would accept both of those. I think so much of it at the beginning of the season is going to be track dependent in terms of which car is going to be best on which track and also what the conditions are going to be like as well. Even though the final day did not go to plan because Lewis in the afternoon wasn't able to complete a race distance and actually spent most of it in the garage, or what I will say is that I was very impressed with the consistency from both of their drivers. Lewis and Charles were so close to each other that I think it points to the fact that Ferrari is a very good baseline, but they just couldn't fine-tune it to get the most performance out of it at this moment in time. Their consistency relative to one another was very impressive. They were very competitive, especially in performance runs. All of their lap times were like within a tenth of each other, which I think again points to the fact that both of them are very comfortable in that car, but the raw speed just isn't quite there. It was very good in a straight line and especially out of traction zones, which I think bodes well for Australia, and that is why when it comes to the combination of both car and the drivers, I have got Ferrari just ahead of Mercedes. In first place, however, and starting the season as the absolute favourites are McLaren. Now, on the negative side, they actually didn't do as much mileage as some of the other teams that only did the 7th most laps on the grid with 381, and that is because they spent a lot of time in the garage. The team found and the drivers found a bit of an oversteer limitation. They had a bit of a balance issue, and even Stella admitted to Sky Sports that they would like a little bit more rear grip, so the team was working through those issues over the course of the 3 days, but when the car was on track, even though Oscar Piastri definitely struggled with it more than Lando did, it was a very fast car despite being a little bit tricky at the limit. There's no doubt that Lando grabbed all of the headlines with his phenomenal race simulation on day 2 that was far and away quicker than what Leclerc and Russell were able to do on track at the time, and I just think that overall, although they do still have some issues to work through, they look more confident and they look more comfortable than any other team on the grid, especially Lando in that car. I think he's got so much confidence and the team has got so much confidence as well. So I am pretty comfortable in saying that McLaren go into 2025 at the moment as the favourites for both Australia and, let's be honest, probably the championship as well. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.